The sky over Earth turned red before anyone realized what was happening as giant ships appeared above the clouds. Stretching across the horizon like floating cities, they came in silence at first. Then, with thunder and flames, people ran into streets, staring upward while others hid behind locked doors, unsure if it was a nightmare or real. The news spread quickly across all channels. Governments issued emergency codes, military bases went into lockdown. But the truth was simple and terrifying. They were not ready for this. No one was. From orbit, the alien ships hovered, unmoved by Earth's panic. Their surface was smooth and black like polished stone. Glowing with strange blue veins of energy, they bore the mark of the tyrant empire, a name whispered. In deep space, a name that brought fear even in distant star systems. Now they were here above Earth. Inside the largest ship at the center of the fleet stood Vor, the supreme warlord of the tyrant empire, tall, armored, and built like a machine with glowing silver eyes and a voice that echoed like thunder. He stood before a galactic communication screen, which showed the leaders of Earth, their faces pale and uncertain, their hands folded in fear. He spoke without emotion, his voice loud enough to shake the hearts of every listener. Humans will kneel before the Empire, as others have. Your world is weak, your people disorganized. Your weapons are ancient, you will bow and serve or be reduced to ash. He waited for a response, but the silence that followed did not bother him. He had said the same to dozens of worlds, and all of them had bowed, some sooner, some later, but they all did in the end. Earth chaos spread, cities shut down, flights stopped, families tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. The enemy was already here. Their shadow covered the planet. Hope was fading, and resistance seemed like a foolish dream. But not for Lena. She stood inside a hidden underground base, somewhere in the northern mountains, surrounded by screens, maps, and a small team of fighters. This base was once a mining facility long abandoned, but now it served as the heart of Earth's last chance. Lena was not born into the military. She had no medals, no rank, but she had something more powerful. She had a reason, a past carved by pain, and a future she refused to surrender. She had seen what the Empire did to other planets. She had watched friends die when alien scouts raided her colony years ago. She had spent years studying, learning, fighting, and preparing because she always knew they would come back. Her team was small, barely 24 men and women, most of them engineers, hackers, and rogue pilots. They were not soldiers, but they believed in her, and she believed in them. While world leaders debated and panicked, Lena was already sending a signal through a hidden relay. It reached the orbiting fleet and forced its way onto the tyrant screens directly into Vor's chamber. There, she appeared on screen, not in a formal uniform, but in combat gear. Her face scarred, her eyes steady, her voice calm and direct. You want us to kneel? I say you first. For a moment, Vor did not speak, his face unreadable, as he looked at the woman who dared challenge him, a single human, without a fleet, without an army, but with fire in her voice and strength in her eyes. Then he laughed, a deep sound like iron grinding on stone, not with humor, but with disbelief. You are brave, little human, but you are mistaken if you think words can save your kind. Lena smiled. Not a warm smile, but one that came from someone who had buried too many friends and lost too much to fear. I don't expect words to save us, but they can start something. They can remind others that we were never meant to crawl. She cut the signal and turned to her team. They were already preparing, silent, focused, determined. They didn't need orders. They had waited for this moment for too long. All across Earth, small cells just like hers lit up old systems, hacked into alien communications. Disabled drones overloaded scout patrols. One by one, the resistance started to breathe of her. Watch the data pour into his command center. Sabotage across multiple regions, energy surges in unexpected locations. His officers reported strange resistance patterns not matching any previous invasion. He stared at the Earth below, no longer just a prize, but now a challenge, something unfamiliar, something dangerous. Ordered his fleet to begin Phase 1 orbital strikes, meant to disable power grids, military installations, and communication centers. The sky turned to fire as beams rained down and towers fell, but hidden under mountains, forests, and oceans, The resistance lived on. Lena felt the first quake as the mountain trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling. Lights flickered. Her team ducked, but none ran. They knew what was coming, and they were ready. She activated a stolen alien core wired with human tech. It sent a pulse upward, striking one of the smaller ships that hovered above the mountain. The ship's core overheated and exploded in flames as debris rained down. It was the first victory, small but loud. It was a message written in fire. Vor looked at the screen, showing the destruction of one of his own ships by what appeared to be primitive tech. And for the first time, his smile vanished. This world was not like the others. This woman was not like the others. He whispered to himself a word he hadn't used in decades. Problem. But Lena wasn't waiting to be studied. She had already moved her team deeper into the tunnels, loading more weapons, charging more cores, preparing for the next phase. She knew this war would be long and bloody, but she also knew one truth stronger than any weapon. They would never kneel, not to Vor, not to anyone, because Earth remembered who they were, and now so would the galaxy. Skies kept burning for hours as the Empire's fleet launched wave after wave of attacks from orbit. Their beams cracked roads, split towers, turned to dust. People screamed and scattered across the cities, but in the middle of all the noise, a strange kind of silence had started to grow, the silence of understanding, the silence of change, because in between the fear, something had awakened, something that no beam, no ship, and no warlord could crush. In underground shelters and broken tunnels across the globe, people had heard Lena's voice, not just her words, but the weight behind them, the way she said them, the strength in her refusal. Her message had slipped through the cracks of the Empire's control and spread like fire across broken radio signals, encrypted transmissions, and stolen channels. It moved faster than their ships could track it. In that message, there was something pure, something honest. It told people one simple thing: the fight was not over, and kneeling was not the only option. Lena stood beside a table in her underground base as her team watched the reports come in. Several alien outposts, sabotaged weapon caches, stolen minor alien drones taken down with clever traps and misdirection, simple farmers hiding EMP charges inside irrigation pump, scavengers rewiring power grids into signal boosters. Every region across Earth had started to resist. They didn't wait for orders, they just acted. This was not a war led by armies. This was a storm built by survivors, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, because someone reminded them that they still had a choice. Lena didn't smile when she saw the reports. Instead, she stared at the map, glowing red with alien-controlled zones, and she whispered to herself that this was just the beginning. They would push harder. Now the Empire would not tolerate defiance. They never had in any world before, and they wouldn't start now. The resistance had to be ready, and readiness meant sacrifice. She turned to her team, gave each one a task without raising her voice. Her presence was enough. Her belief in them was silent but unshakable. They moved with purpose, each knowing that they might not see the next sunrise, but also knowing that if they succeeded, someone else might. In the Empire's flagship, Vor stood at the center of his war chamber, his fists clenched behind his back. His officers lined up with nervous eyes as data screens showed the unexpected chaos unfolding below. Their fleet had never faced such scattered but persistent resistance before. These humans were not behaving like the other species they had conquered. They were not collapsing. They were becoming sharper. Vor demanded answers, his voice calm but full of cold anger. How had a primitive world crippled 3 scout stations? How did they know the patrol routes? Why were their systems being hacked when humans were not supposed to understand? Tyron Code, one of his advisors, hesitated, then spoke. She explained that the humans were using adapted tech from the old scout ships lost in previous decades. They had reverse-engineered pieces from past wreckages, combining them with their own crude systems in ways the Empire never thought possible. They weren't just resisting, they were learning. Vor stared at the glowing screen, showing a massive energy surge in the region. Once thought inactive was Lena's base, though. They didn't know her name yet, only her voice, only her face, and that was enough to make her dangerous. Ordered her captured alive. He wanted this symbol of resistance to kneel in front of the galaxy. He wanted to break her in front of her people, but it would not be that easy back in the tunnels. Lena and her second-in-command, Jacob, were preparing for their next move. Jacob had been with her from the beginning, a former systems engineer, turned rebel his. Knowledge of alien tech had saved them more than once. He looked tired, but his eyes burned. With the same fire Lena carried, they were setting up a mobile uplink that would hijack the Empire's main comm line for just a few seconds, enough to send a broadcast across their entire fleet, and the enslaved planets beyond it, was risky, extremely dangerous, and might alert the enemy to their exact location, but Lena knew the value of words. She had seen what a single message could do as they calibrated the system. There was a sudden tremor followed by the sound of distant metal tearing. Jacob froze, then turned to the radar. 3 blips moving fast, coming straight for them. The Empire had found them. Lena gave no speech, no orders. She simply nodded, and her team moved, splitting into defense positions, sealing side tunnels, preparing for evacuation. This wasn't a surprise. They had always known it would come. The first explosion tore through the northern wall. The ceiling cracked. Dust fell. The tunnel filled with smoke as alien drones rushed in with cold red lights, scanning and shooting their weapons, humming with deadly energy. But the resistance was ready. They used the narrow tunnels to their advantage, forcing the enemy into tight spaces, dropping mines that triggered magnetic fields, jamming the drones. Mid-air fighters used grapples and hand-built launchers to disable the machines piece by piece, and in the middle of it all, Lena moved like a shadow, covering her people, giving orders, pulling the wounded to safety, returning fire without hesitation. Jacob stayed behind to guard the uplink, but a blast shook the chamber and fire spread across the walls. He saw the readings spike. The system would overload soon. Lena shouted for him to retreat, but he shouted back that the signal must go out, that it was worth everything. With a final pull of the trigger, he launched the broadcast. The signal ripped through the alien network, and in that one moment, across dozens of enemy ships, across enslaved worlds and hidden colonies, Lena's voice echoed again. "We were told to bow. We chose to rise. We are not afraid, not anymore." The screen went black and the uplink chamber collapsed. Lena reached the site moments later and pulled Jacob from the wreckage. He was alive, but badly hurt. His hands burned, his breath shallow. He looked up at her and smiled faintly. "Was it worth it?" She nodded and whispered, "They heard you." In the Empire's warship, Vor slammed his fist against the console as the image of Lena's face once again appeared without warning across his fleet. He was being challenged not by an army, not by a planet, but by an idea, a voice that refused to be silenced. He turned to his generals and gave one command: crush her. But Earth was changing, and Lena was no longer alone. Sun had not risen when Lena stepped out of the emergency tunnel, her uniform stained with dust and blood. Mountain behind her still trembled with the aftershock of the Empire's attack. Smoke climbed quietly into the sky, and small fires glowed in the distance. The resistance had survived, but just barely. The enemy had come harder and faster than they expected, and not everyone made it out. Beside her lay Jacob, still unconscious, his breathing shallow and uneven. Medics worked quickly around him, trying to stabilize his condition. He had taken the full force of the explosion to ensure the message went out, and now he was barely clinging to life. Lena watched him without speaking, her hands clenched at her sides, her heart heavy but her eyes steady. Around the camp, people moved in silence, burying the dead, cleaning the wounded, salvaging what equipment they could from the wreckage. No one complained, no one broke down. They knew what they were part of, and they accepted the weight of it. The loss was sharp, but it did not break them, shape them. Lena walked through the camp, stopping to speak with every survivor, asking what they needed, checking supplies, offering comfort, but not promises. She had learned long ago that promises in war were too easily broken. All she could offer was truth, and her truth was simple. They had hurt the Empire, and the Empire would now come with everything it had far above Earth, inside the Empire's flagship. Vor stared at the black screen that once again carried Lena's voice. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated these humans. They were not the same as the others. They did not kneel, and they did not run. They broke patterns and turned fear into fuel. He saw their attacks. Grow smarter, their movements more organized, their signals more encrypted, and difficult to track, he turned to his high command and demanded the full-scale lockdown of Earth. No ship would be allowed in or out. No signal unchecked, no structure untouched. He wanted their resistance burned from the ground up, not just destroyed, but erased as if it never existed. One of his generals raised a concern about the optics of such aggression, that crushing a small group of rebels with overwhelming force might stir sympathy in other controlled worlds, but Vor silenced him with a look. The Empire was built on fear, and fear only worked when it was absolute. Back on Earth, Lena gathered her remaining team leaders inside a dimly lit chamber, their faces worn and hardened but eyes burning with quiet determination. Maps and digital grids covered the walls, showing regions affected by the Empire's retaliation. She pointed to several key areas where Empire bases had been constructed along the coastline: fuel depots, relays, and weapon storage units. If they could strike fast enough and hit the core structures, they could buy time, maybe even drive the fleet back a few steps, enough to breathe, enough to plan their next move. But everyone in that room knew what that meant. It meant they would lose more people. It meant some of them would not return. It meant sacrifices. They had already given so much, but now the cost was rising, and still no one backed away. No one asked for easier tasks. They had chosen this war not because they loved fighting, but because they refused slavery. That night, Lena sat alone under the cracked roof of a half-buried outpost. She stared at the stars, wondering how many other worlds out there had been silenced. How many voices were crushed before they could speak? How many others like her had stood once and then fallen with no one left to remember them? She didn't feel like a hero. She felt tired and cold and filled with a sadness she couldn't show. A soft voice behind her broke the silence. It was Mira, one of the younger members of the team, carrying 2 metal cups of heated rations. She sat beside Lena without saying much and handed her a cup. Both stared at the firelight flickering in front of them. Myra spoke gently, telling Lena that the broadcast had reached farther than they thought. Encrypted replies had come from old Martian colonies, hidden outposts deep in the asteroid belt, and even from within enemy zones controlled by the Empire. Resistance was waking, not just on Earth but beyond it, and Lena was the voice they all recognized, the one that sparked the flame. Lena nodded slowly, but her thoughts remained with Jacob and the others who had paid for that signal with pain and blood. She whispered a quiet thank you and promised herself again that this war would not end with silence. It would end with the Empire hearing Earth's answer in every corner of the galaxy. The next morning, the plan began. The Resistance split into smaller squads, each assigned to strike specific targets. Lena led one of the teams herself. Their objective was an energy supply station guarded by heavy drones and fortified walls, but they had studied its patterns for weeks. They knew the rotation of guards, the weak spots in the shielding, and the moments when the security grid rebooted. They moved under the cover of darkness, through forest and broken roads, through tunnels and abandoned rail lines, until they reached the outer perimeter. Lena gave no long speech, only a short nod, and her team moved with precision, placing charges, cutting lines, redirecting power bursts to create chaos inside the station. When the first explosion went off, the facility erupted in confusion, and Lena's team rushed in. Blaster fire lit the corridors. Drones tried to respond, but their systems were already infected with resistance code, scrambling their orders and locking their weapons. The team reached the core chamber and set the final charge. As alarms wailed and lights flickered, they retreated into the trees. Moments before the explosion tore the station apart. In a column of blue light, it was a small victory, but it mattered because it sent a new message, one louder than words, that Earth was not waiting anymore. Earth was hunting far above the planet. Vor watched the feed showing the destruction of the energy station. His jaw tightened, his rage silent but burning. He stared at the image of the human woman, once again flashing on his monitor, her eyes calm and defiant, her words still echoing from the last broadcast. She had become a symbol, and symbols were harder to kill than people. He ordered every available ship to prepare for a direct ground assault. He would land himself. He would find this woman and make her kneel in front of her people. But Lena was already preparing for him. The wind carried the sound of distant thunder, but it was not from clouds or storms. It was from engines massive and cold, rising from orbit and descending toward Earth. The Empire's ships had begun to land. Vor had grown tired of watching from above, tired of failure and delay. And now he was coming himself to crush the resistance with his own hands. Lena watched the skies as the shadow of the main carrier ship darkened. The valley near the southern ridge, it was larger than any vessel they had seen before, covered in dark steel, marked with the blood-red crest of the Tyran Empire. Its landing broke the earth, sending shockwaves through the nearby hills, but Lena stood without flinching because she had been preparing for this moment. Since the day the Empire returned to Earth, she gathered her team around the large table inside the command bunker. Maps of the region lit up before them, lines, drawn circles marked positions, targets, and weaknesses. Her voice was clear as she explained. The next step, they were not going to run. They were going into the heart of the enemy ship to confront Vor face to face. Her second in command for this mission was a quiet man named Reed, once a space station engineer, now turned resistance fighter. He had no battlefield medals, but his brain was a weapon, and he had spent weeks studying the Empire's flagship models. He had found a flaw, a hidden maintenance tunnel beneath the carrier structure used during energy refuels. It was unguarded during specific intervals, and it led deep into the ship's central systems. It was a one-way mission. There would be no backup, no rescue. If caught, no retreat. If the doors closed, but everyone in the room nodded, because they knew that stopping Vor meant more than survival. It meant ending the chain of fear that stretched beyond Earth into 100 silent worlds. At midnight, Lena and her small squad moved silently across the broken field, staying low between the rocks and ruins. The massive ship loomed above like a floating fortress, its underbelly glowing with reactor heat and mechanical. They reached the access point just as the core cycle reached the low-power phase. A narrow window of 10 minutes entered the dark tunnel, climbing through the metal throat of the beast with nothing but flashlights and handheld scanners. Every corner could hold death, but they moved without hesitation because they had chosen this path long before this night. Inside the ship, the corridors were wide, cold, and filled with the low humming sound of power flowing through its veins. They avoided cameras, using old Tyran cloaking devices stolen during previous raids. Each step took them deeper into the heart of the enemy, closer to Vor, who sat high above them, surrounded by guards, unaware that the storm was already inside his walls. Lena felt the weight of silence, the kind that came before something irreversible. She looked at her team, some of whom had followed her since the first strike. Others joined only weeks ago, yet all of them were bound by the same fire, and for a moment, she thought of those who had fallen: Jacob, Mira, others whose names would never be known by history, and she whispered to herself that this was for them. Reed guided them through a narrow shaft that opened into the inner control deck, a level below the command bridge, where Vor would be standing watching screens, giving orders, believing himself untouchable. Lena planted the first signal jammer near the energy conduit, cutting off the central comms to slow down any alarms. Then the others placed charges around the power grid, not to destroy the ship, but to trap those inside. The final part of the plan was simple and dangerous. Lena would go up alone. While the others secured the exit route, she would confront Vor in front of his guards on his own ground. She would look him in the eyes and speak the words he had mocked when this war began. The elevator to the bridge was heavily guarded, but Lena moved fast, using a brief surge in the grid caused by the jammers. The lights flickered, and in that second, she slipped through the main door, her rifle ready, her face hidden behind a hood. Inside the command bridge, Vor stood at the center, his massive figure turned toward a screen showing Earth's surface. His back was straight, his armor polished, his confidence unshaken. But when he turned to face the intruder and saw the symbol of Earth sewn on the shoulder of her jacket, he froze. For the first time since the invasion began, she pulled back the hood, revealing her face to him and to every officer in the room. It was her, the voice, the woman, the problem that refused to devour, stepped forward, slowly like a beast sizing its prey, and his voice was low as he said that he had given her many chances to kneel, that she could still live. If she accepted her place beneath him, that her people would stop suffering if she bent just once. Lena's rifle was lowered by her side. Her hands relaxed, her breathing calm, and when she answered, her voice was louder than any weapon, her words sharp and clean. She told him that humanity never asked to rule. They only asked to live free, that his empire was built on fear, and fear was cracking that every ship, every drone, and every blade he owned could not erase one simple truth: they had already risen, and they would never bow. The room stayed silent. No one moved, not even the guards, because they saw something in her eyes that no armor could reflect. A storm that had already begun. Ver stepped closer, towering above her, his eyes glowing with fury. He raised his hand to strike, but before he could move, Lena looked at him without blinking and said the words she had carried since day one: "You first." At that exact moment, the charges below the deck triggered, not to destroy the ship, but to flood the bridge. With a pulse that knocked out all weapons and locked the blast doors, sealing them inside, Lena knew her time was short, and she took the moment to transmit a live signal through the ship's broadcast system, showing her face, showing Vor defeated, unarmed, trapped beside her. She looked into the camera and said one final thing: "We do not kneel, and now your war ends where it began, with a choice." Far across space and systems ruled by the Empire, people saw her face and heard her voice, and something inside them shifted because they too remembered what freedom felt like. And in that moment, the Empire began to crack. The command bridge of the Empire's flagship had turned into a chamber of silence. Vor stood still, his heavy boots firm on the floor, his jaw tight, his silver eyes burning with disbelief as the locked blast doors sealed the room and shut out the world around them. Lena faced him. With her hands steady and her voice still ringing in the air, she had said the words that had shaken the galaxy, not with rage or threat, but with calm defiance, the kind that makes even warlords hesitate. All across the ship, the crew had paused their tasks, staring at screens where Lena's face had appeared through the emergency broadcast. The transmission was short but powerful. Not only her message, but the image of Vor standing beside her, unarmed and speechless, the great warlord who had conquered dozens of planets, now trapped by the very humans he had come to crush. Ver made one last move, his arm reaching for the emergency override panel beside the command chair. But Lena stepped forward and raised her rifle, not to fire but to remind him that she had control, that she had come this far, not to win a moment, but to end a war. She spoke clearly, telling him that it was over, not because she had killed him, but because he had already lost the moment he believed humans would break. Under fear, he had forgotten that humans adapt, that they rise when crushed, that they carry pain like fire and turn loss into strength. Looked at her with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He had seen rebellion before, seen soldiers fight with madness in their eyes and anger in their hearts. But Lena had something else. Her fire came from something deeper, not hatred, but purpose, not revenge, but refusal, the kind of refusal that reshapes history. On Earth, the resistance had already begun to strike. Key Empire installations went dark one by one. Energy depots exploded, communication towers collapsed, local patrols found themselves surrounded by people who were no longer afraid. Across spaceships and distant colonies stopped answering orders as their crews watched the broadcast and began to question everything they had believed. Somewhere on Mars, a small group of enslaved miners broke open the sealed hatch of a weapons crate they had hidden for years. A mother in a distant orbital station whispered to her son that freedom had a face now, and it looked like there's a mechanic inside. A Tyrant outpost deactivated the internal scanners and left the gates unlocked because something inside him had changed. Lena stood in front of Vor and told him that this war would not end with surrender or treaties, it would end with choice. The Empire had offered only one path: submission or death, but now there was another path, and it came from Earth, a planet once dismissed as weak, now rising like a storm across the stars. Vor As silence stretched longer than expected, his pride wounded more than his body. He had built his legacy on power, on fear. On obedience, he had never imagined that a single voice could undo what fleets could not. But now he saw that power was not only measured in weapons and ships. Sometimes it lived in a message, sometimes in a single act of defiance, and that was something. Even his empire could not control. The ship's main systems began to crash one by one as resistance hackers across Earth triggered the final protocol. The code had been hidden inside stolen tech smuggled into the ship during the earlier ground raids. The result was slow but unstoppable, a complete lockdown of all Empire fleet movements in the sector. Nothing could move, no signal could escape, no command could override the virus. Lena lowered her weapon and walked past Vor toward the command panel. She accessed the manual override and opened a secure channel to every ship within the fleet. Her voice echoed through every deck, every room, every outpost, on every screen. Her message was short and final. You followed him because you feared him. You feared what would happen if you stood alone. Now you are not alone. Now you have a choice. Did not ask them to fight or follow her. She only told them the truth, that Earth had spoken and would not kneel, and what came next was no longer her decision. It belonged to every soul still listening. In the days that followed, some ships left quietly, slipping away into the darkness, unwilling to fight a war that had already turned. Others surrendered, turning their weapons off and lowering their banners. A few, still loyal to Vor, tried to strike, but they found themselves surrounded by fleets that no longer believed in conquest. Vor was taken into custody, not as a prisoner of revenge, but as a symbol of a fading age. He was not executed. He was not tortured. He was held in silence while the galaxy watched and remembered the moment the Empire broke without a single planet being destroyed. Lena returned to Earth, not with celebration, but with purpose. She visited the cities that had been burned. She stood with the families that had lost, and she promised that no one would be forgotten. She helped rebuild not just structures but trust. And she kept her words simple, honest, and true. People called her a hero, but she never used the word. She called herself one of many, just a voice that refused to go quiet when it mattered most. Years later, stories of that war would be told not through statues or songs, but through shared memories, whispered from parent to child, from teacher to student. Stories of a planet that stood when it was supposed to fall, of a voice that echoed across space and said no when silence would have been easier. And whenever someone asked how it all began, someone would always answer the same way. The alien warlord said, "Bow before us," and she replied, "You first." The end.